Welcome to the APA podcast, where we help one another follow Jesus at home, in our city, and around the world.
All right, grab your Bibles or your devices. You can open up to the book of Romans. Next week is Thanksgiving. And with that coming up, I'm sure some of you are planning some family gatherings. Maybe you've got some in-laws or outlaws coming over. Maybe you've got some grandparents or aunts and uncles that you're having to your place, or you're going to their place. And family gatherings can be awesome, but they can also be very challenging. Even among blood, there's a lot of difference. And over time, those differences can be emphasized too greatly and cause division within the family. And sometimes you get to a family gathering and you're just trying your best. You're white-knuckling your way through it, and you're just thinking, I need to not let this person get on my nerves. I need to not respond to this thing. I hope Uncle Bob doesn't talk about politics. I hope Aunt Susan doesn't find the wine. There's all kinds of challenges that you might find in these family gatherings. And so you don't want to, get into that. And so, sometimes, we got these crazy relatives. And if you're saying, I'm so blessed, I don't have any crazy relatives at my Thanksgiving dinner, you're it. You're the one that everyone is bracing for. But as we start in this series in the book of Romans, one of the big themes, one of the big challenges that the Romans are facing is the fact that family gatherings are difficult. And there was a lot of differences within the spiritual family that was the Roman church, probably multiple house churches. They were struggling with unity. They had different views and perspectives on how things should be done in the church and how they should relate to God and to each other. And we'll get into that as we go along. So it's about the family gathering, but more so, Romans is about God. Romans is about what God has done and is doing to make things right in the world and to make things right in the family. The book of Romans uses this word a lot, righteousness. Righteousness. Depending on your translation, we'll probably be using the New Living Translation for most of the series. Uses the word right or make things right. But you'll see righteousness quite often in the book, particularly in this first chapter that we'll look at. When that word refers to God, God's righteousness, it simply is talking about what God is doing to do what is right. God's righteousness equals, you see this on the screen, God doing what is right. God doing what is right. But the definition of what is right is not up to you and me. We don't decide what is right and then start to, judge God to see whether or not he's doing the right thing. We're not the judge of him. He's the judge of us. So how do we know then whether God is being righteous? How do we know if he's doing what is right? So what it means, particularly in Romans then, is that God is fulfilling his promises. God has promised that he would act in a certain way and do certain things for him to be righteous. And he needs to live up to what he says. He needs to fulfill his own promises for him to be acting righteously. So Romans reveals God's righteousness by describing the surprising way that God has been faithful to his promises and how through his promises, God is establishing and unifying a global family. So our text for today, we're going to expand on all these themes as we go, but we're starting in Romans 1, verse 1 to 17. You can open to that. I'm going to split it into two chunks. We'll start with verses 1 through 8. So starting in verse 1. This letter is from Paul, a slave of Christ, chosen by God to be an apostle and sent out to preach his good news. Your translation might say gospel. Gospel means good news. God promised this good news long ago through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. The good news is about his son. In his earthly life, he was born into King David's family line, and he was shown to be the Son of God when he was raised from the dead by the power of the Holy Spirit. He is Jesus Christ our Lord. Through Christ, God has given us the privilege and authority as apostles to tell Gentiles everywhere what God has done for them, so that they will believe and obey him, bringing glory to his name. And you are included among those Gentiles who have been called to belong to Jesus Christ. I am writing to all of you in Rome who are loved by God and are called to be his own holy people. May God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ give you grace and peace. So like most of Paul's letters, he starts it by introducing himself. He says, Paul, he's chosen by God to be an apostle and sent out to preach his good news. So Paul, if you know his story, was formerly a Jewish rabbi. His Jewish name was Saul, but when he became a follower of Jesus and began to plant churches outside of Israel, he went by his Greek name, Paul. But so Paul, he was formerly this Jewish rabbi, and as a Jewish rabbi, he was passionately devoted to the Jewish law and the traditions of his people. He had believed that the biggest problem in Israel was the lack of devotion to the law. God had shown his people through the law how they were to live, how they were to govern themselves, how they were to treat one another, rituals and rules and sacrifices and Sabbaths and all sorts of ways in which they were supposed to live. But his people for generations had failed to live up to God's law. And as a result, they had experienced God's judgment. Successions of other empires would come in and conquer them, and they'd be subject to nations like the Babylonians or the Persians or the Syrians. And at the time of the writing of this letter, it was Rome. Rome was overlord over Israel. They didn't have their own political and religious freedom to govern themselves. And in Saul's mind, that was because they hadn't lived up to the requirements of the law. So if we could only get our acts together, if we could only do the right things, if we could only just be righteous, then everything would go better. So for Saul, anything that stood in the way of his people more closely following the law of God, he was zealously opposed to it. So when this Jesus movement began that talked all about grace and they weren't following the law and they didn't care about the temple anymore, Saul got really angry and he started to zealously persecute the church and try to shut it down anytime he could. Now there's a challenge with Paul's views on human righteousness. So we defined righteousness for God as him fulfilling his promises. He would make a promise, and for him to be righteous, he needs to do what he says he would do. And so let's think about that for ourselves. If that's righteousness for humans, have you fulfilled every promise you've ever made? Have you lived up to every single standard you placed on yourself or others? See, the problem with human righteousness is that we are so weak in terms of actually doing what is right that even when we make bold declarations, this is right and this is wrong, and I promise to do this and I promise not to do that, and I commit to do this and I commit not to do that. Think New Year's resolutions. We always fail to live up even to our own standards. But the problem is deeper than that, because human righteousness isn't based on our standards and our promises. Human righteousness is based on God's standard. So if we can't even live up to our own standards, how are we ever going to live up to God's standard? If the only way for us to be righteous, if the only way for us to experience God's freedom and his prosperity and his fullness for us is to be righteous according to the law, of course we're going to fail over and over and over again. But that was Paul's passion, that people would follow the law, and if he could just force them to do it, and maybe we could legislate them to do it, and we could punish the wrongdoers, and we could put them in jail or cast them out, and then Israel will be free. This is the doctrine of sin, and it's actually probably the easiest thing about Christianity to prove to a skeptic. Because you can ask them that question: have you fulfilled every promise you've ever made? Have you fulfilled every commitment you've ever made? No, that's sin. We can't live up even to our own standards. We need help. Where will we get it? Something's broken. So Paul thought the law of Israel would do it. We could force people to follow it. So we're going to shut down these churches and cast out all the unrighteous people and make sure people do the right thing. But Saul, again, if you know his story, had this dramatic conversion experience where Jesus made a special appearance from him, came down from heaven and said, Saul, what are you doing? You're actually going to be an apostle. You're going to go and take the good news of God's grace and tell all the Gentile people. Gentile is a word that means non-Jewish people. For the Jews, there were two kinds of people. There were Jews and there were Gentiles. Anybody who wasn't a Jew was a Gentile. So when you hear that language, that's what they're talking about. So Paul realized, as he became a follower of Jesus, that his theory about how to produce human righteousness was never going to work, and he learned that God had a better plan, a surprising plan, and that plan was called the gospel. That plan was called the good news of Jesus. Verse 2 says this: God promised this good news long ago through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures. The good news is about his Son. So here we have it. God made a promise long ago through the prophets. Here's God's promise. And if God's going to be righteous, he needs to fulfill his promise. The good news is about his Son. Jesus, who he goes on to say, Jesus was born as an heir to the line of King David. So he came as the King of the Jews. He was revealed to be God's Son because he died on the cross and rose from the dead, and he reigns forever today. This is the good news. There is a new kingdom. There is a new king who reigns forever. There's transformation that happens as we put our trust in him. The king has come, died, and came back to life and lives today. And Paul says, this is the message that I was told to take not just to the Israelites, but to the Gentile nations. So the book of Romans becomes a very interesting letter for a lot of reasons. Rome, of course, was the capital of the massive and powerful Roman Empire. And the primary audience that Paul is talking to were the non-Jewish followers in the churches of Rome. So there were Jewish people in the churches of Rome. I'll explain that in a minute. But his primary audience was to the non-Jewish followers, the Gentile followers. And so a bunch of what Paul says to the Gentile believers in Rome is actually about their relationship to the Jewish believers in Rome. The Jewish believers at this time had experienced all kinds of persecution. In Roman culture, they would have had less power and less privilege in society. They were likely a marginalized group. They would have had trouble with getting jobs or running businesses. They would have been looked upon with skepticism and probably racism in Rome. And some of the skepticism and some of the judgmental attitude was actually coming from their Gentile Christian brothers and sisters. And so check out this passage from Acts 18 that gives us some historical context for what's going on. Acts 18, 1-2, says this is when Paul is starting to plant churches. It says he left Athens and went to Corinth. There he became acquainted with a Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently arrived from Italy with his wife Priscilla. They had left Italy when Claudius Caesar deported all Jews from Rome. So we actually have early writings from a Roman historian named Suetonius, who tells us that in about 49 AD, Emperor Claudius expelled any Jewish person, all Jewish people from Rome. Get out of Rome, you're not welcome here, get out. And there was some sort of conflict going on, possibly related to conflict around Jesus in Rome, and so Emperor Claudius just had enough, everybody get out of here. But then 5 years later, they were allowed to return. And so you can imagine, it's like Thanos' snap, right? All the Jews disappeared from Rome, and then all of a sudden they came back and they were reintegrating, and the reintegration in the church became a massive challenge because these Jewish believers in Jesus came back to a very non-Jewish church. They came back to a church that for 5 years did not have to learn how to integrate people who had come through the Jewish traditions and had come through the Jewish law. And so they showed up, and of course, no one's practicing Sabbath, no one's circumcised, no one's eating kosher, no one's following the Jewish traditions, no one's doing any of this stuff. And it became a very uncomfortable experience for them, especially when they would have grown up completely separated from the Gentile world. And here they are trying to worship Jesus, and it became a significant challenge. How can we be righteous? How can these Gentiles be righteous if they're not following the law? That was a huge question for them. So the Gentile Christians were very prone to judge the Jewish Christians and possibly alienate them within the church. And I think we underappreciate sometimes the challenge for the early Jewish Christians. Jesus, if you remember, was the Jewish Messiah. They were the ones who for thousands of years were waiting for a Messiah to come. Jesus was the King of the Jews. He was the one from the line of King David, a Jewish king, to come and establish his reign that would begin in Israel and expand to the ends of the earth. But very quickly, as Christianity spread outside of Jerusalem, it became a Gentile movement. It became inundated with Gentiles. It was almost a surprise to the early Jewish believers because actually the message was being rejected en masse by most of the Jewish people, and it was accepted en masse by so many Gentiles. So all of a sudden, Jews who were used to laws that actually kept them separated from Gentiles were integrating with others who were calling Jesus their Lord, and they had to do church together. So think about this, practically speaking. Imagine you've got a church potluck, and everybody's showing up with their favorite food, and you, as a Jewish believer, you made your aunt's famous matzo ball soup, and you're bringing it to put it on the table for everyone to enjoy. And as you put it down, you look to the side, to the dish that's already there, and it's bacon-wrapped shrimp. And if you know, like Jews were not allowed to eat bacon or seafood. And now just by placing your aunt's matzo ball soup beside this dish, you could not even eat the matzo ball soup according to Jewish traditions. It had become unclean. So now what you have for something as simple as a church potluck is a large percentage of the church just isn't showing up to it anymore because they can't eat what's on the table. So you have accepted your Jewish Messiah. You're excited that the Messiah has come, and you go to church and you're alienated. You're pushed aside. You have no opportunity and leadership in the church because all these Gentiles who do things and see things so differently have taken over. So there were some big questions being asked in the Roman church. One of the questions might have been this, that the Jews would have asked: do Gentiles need to become Jewish to be faithful to God? All the Jews knew was the law, the covenant. God had outlined how to live, moral codes, sacrifices, traditions, dietary restrictions, the types of clothing they could wear. And the Jews were brought up to strictly follow these things because that's how you became faithful to God. That's how you practiced righteousness. That's how you lived up to your purpose as a human being. And then the Gentiles flood the Jewish movement. They weren't circumcised. They ate the wrong kind of food. They wore the wrong clothes. They worked on the Sabbath. So many Jews thought, don't we need to make them Jewish first so they can follow Jesus? Don't we need to teach them the laws? Don't we need to teach them kosher eating? Don't we need to get them all circumcised? Don't we need to get them to wear the right clothes? And then they can follow Jesus. And that wasn't a unique challenge in Rome. Paul addressed it in many other letters. But let's consider how this challenge might translate to a 21st century church. I don't know if you're aware of this, but even today, people have very different ideas about how best to follow Jesus. What does righteousness look like? What are the right things to do as a Christian? Within the global church, there are disagreements on doctrine, which are the various teachings about the nature of God and what it means to be a follower of Jesus and what church should look like. There are differences in the church on how we engage with culture, moral practices, bioethical issues. What's more important, justice for the poor or personal morality? Some people want longer worship on Sundays. Some people want shorter. Some people want a longer sermon. Some people want a shorter one. The pastor should be more passionate when he preaches. No, the pastor should be more of a teacher when he preaches. The pastor needs to spend more time on visitation. He should spend more time studying. The music needs to be quieter. The music needs to be louder. We need more programs. We need less programs. I wish we went back to the old way we did things. No, we need to move on to the new. We need more discipleship. No, we need more outreach. No, we need more missions. No, we need more Bible studies. No, we need more prayer meetings. We should talk more about political issues. We should talk less about political issues. And you're all in the same building. And I get emails from all of you. If it were just one issue, it wouldn't be that big of a challenge. But you stack them all together and it creates big challenges to be a unified family. I love this quote I found in a Romans commentary from a guy named J.R. Daniel Kirk. One of the most important purposes of Romans is to advocate for a Christian community in which people who know they have the right answers live together with other people who do not. Those other Christians, by the way, also know that they have the right answers. It's a challenge. Various groups within every church are convinced they are right, but they sit beside other people who disagree with them, and they are convinced they're right as well. How do we get along? Has God done anything that's powerful enough that these differing groups can still have fellowship together? Is there anything God has done that can bring a diverse community of many different backgrounds, many different nations and tongues and experiences together under one roof, worshiping the same Lord by the same Spirit? The answer is absolutely, he has done something powerful enough. And it's described in what Paul calls the good news. The good news, the gospel of Jesus Christ. The letter to the Romans is Paul's most thorough explanation of the gospel and how it brings all believers together into one family. Another question that the Jews might have had in the Roman church or in the church in general: if so many Jews have rejected God's Messiah, has God failed? I mean, this is the Jewish Messiah, the Jewish king, and en masse, the Jews have rejected him. Does that mean God has failed? When we get to chapters 9 to 11, by the way, we're doing Romans all the way through, probably in 4 separate series. So we're doing Romans 1 to 4 between now and the end of November, and then we'll pick it up again sometime in the new year. But when we get to chapters 9 to 11, we'll see Paul addressing this issue of God's promises to the nation of Israel. So many of the Israelites had rejected Jesus, and it became a predominantly Gentile movement. Today, it's vastly a Gentile movement. There are churches in Israel, there are Messianic Jews, absolutely, but it's vastly a Messianic movement. What happened to God's promises to Israel? Christians even today can participate in viewing Jewish people negatively in terms of their rejection of Jesus, their Messiah, sometimes blaming them for pridefully sticking to a law-based righteousness. But Gentile Christians in Rome, they were doing this similar thing, and Paul reminds them and us that God still loves Israel, even if he doesn't love everything Israel does. God remains committed to fulfill his covenant with his people. And Romans is an explanation about the surprising way in which God has proven himself to be faithful to his promises. So there's many other big questions that we'll get to as we go along in this series, but I want to get to one last idea, and I want to read the rest of our text before we do that. Verse 8. Let me say first that I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith in him is being talked about all over the world. God knows how often I pray for you. Day and night I bring you and your needs in prayer to God, whom I serve with all my heart by spreading the good news about his Son. One of the things I always pray for you for is the opportunity, God willing, to come at last to see you. For I long to visit you so I can bring you some spiritual gift that will help you grow strong in the Lord. When we get together, I want to encourage you in your faith, but I also want to be encouraged by yours. I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters, that I planned many times to visit you, but I was prevented until now. I want to work among you and see spiritual fruit, just as I have seen among other Gentiles. For I have a great sense of obligation to people, both in the civilized world and the rest of the world, to the educated and uneducated alike. So I am eager to come to you in Rome, too, to preach the good news. So Paul has actually never visited Rome. He didn't plant the Roman church, but still, as the apostle to the Gentiles, he felt a measure of responsibility and care for this church, just like other churches he wrote letters to. And so he's praying for an opportunity. He wants to visit them. He wants to strengthen them. And we see later in the book that he's wanting to establish the Roman church as a launching ground so that he can continue planting churches further west into Spain. Verse 16, this is the last thing that I wanted to look at, and we'll jump from here for the rest of the morning. For I am not ashamed of this good news, this gospel about Christ. It is the power of God at work, saving everyone who believes, the Jew first and also the Gentile. It came first to the Jews, but it also extends to the non-Jews. This good news tells us how God makes us right in his sight. This is accomplished from start to finish by faith. As the scriptures say, it is through faith that a righteous person has life. Paul says, I am not ashamed of this good news about Christ. I am not ashamed of the gospel. The good news, let me remind you, verse 3-4, let's reread this again. The good news is about his son. In his earthly life, he was born into King David's family line, and he was shown to be the Son of God when he was raised from the dead by the power of the Holy Spirit. He is Jesus Christ, our Lord. This is what he will expound upon through the rest of the book. But the question I was asking myself in preparation was, why would Paul even mention not being ashamed? Like, had someone accused Paul of being ashamed of the gospel? I thought it's impossible that someone was accusing him of being ashamed by the gospel, because by now they knew that Paul had been tortured for the gospel. He had been imprisoned for the gospel. He had been beaten for the gospel. He had been dragged outside of a city and stoned to death, and someone prayed for him, and he came back to life and went back into the city to preach more of the gospel. Obviously, he's not ashamed of the gospel, so why is he bringing up this idea of being ashamed of the gospel? I think it's because Paul recognized that the people in Rome were ashamed of the gospel, and that it's possible for followers of Jesus like us, whether or not we will say those words or not, but through our actions and through our lack of faith, represent that we are ashamed of the gospel. So let's look at this quickly. Why were the Romans ashamed of the good news? Paul declared in his explanation of the gospel that Jesus is the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and all glory belongs to him. But for a Roman, they would have grown up once calling Caesar the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And what gave Caesar the right to those titles? It was because Caesar defeated all the other kings and overthrew all the other lords. He had used his army, he had used his power, he had used his wealth to dominate everybody else. So of course he was the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But now Roman Christians are being told, take your allegiance away from Caesar. He's no longer your Lord. He's no longer your king. And now you are allegiant to Jesus. But how did Jesus become King of Kings and Lord of Lords? Did he have an army? Did he rule an empire? Did he dominate and destroy? No, Jesus became King of Kings and Lord of Lords by dying on a cross. He was coronated with a crown that scarred his brow. He died and was buried in a grave. His victory was in crucifixion, vindicated by his resurrection. He is not a dominator and a military leader like Caesar. He is a suffering servant. And so the Romans might have had this sense of being ashamed of the gospel because they would have been associated no longer with the power and might of the most powerful military in the world, but now they were associated with the weakness of the cross of a suffering servant. Put that inscription on the screen there, Pastor Peter. You can't really see what this is. Just hold that there for a second. But what this is a cutout of stone that was found in Rome, the city of Rome, in about 200 AD. And you may or may not be able to make out that there's some scratches on it. And so go to the next one. This is what the scratches actually look like. So this was graffiti found in Rome in about 200 AD. And someone with about my artistic ability drew this on the wall. And what you can see is there's a man standing to your left there, and he's got a hand raised, and above him is a man hanging on a cross. But his head has been drawn as a donkey's head in mockery of what's happening here. And you can see lettering there. The lettering is in Greek, and it reads this: Alexamenos worships his God. So somebody knew a guy named Alexamenos who was a follower of Jesus, and he thought how ridiculous it is that Alexamenos would worship a crucified God. This donkey of a ruler and king who was crucified on one of our Roman crosses that show the power of Caesar. Here's Alexamenos worshiping his God. It's possible that Alexamenos could have been ashamed of the gospel because this is how his friends saw his faith. Secondly, why were the Jews possibly ashamed of the good news in Rome? They might have been ashamed because of the perceived lack of ability of the gospel to bring about the kind of character transformation that they had depended on the law to bring. The law in the Bible was clear. Do this, don't do that. You can eat these foods, you can't eat those foods. You can wear these clothes, you can't wear those clothes. On Saturday, everybody does this. On Monday, everybody does that. Here's all the festivals you follow. Here's the detailed instructions how to do that and don't do that. And all of a sudden, this gospel of grace shows up and says, hey, it's not about rules and rituals. It's not about external righteousness. This is what the whole Sermon on the Mount is about. Jesus says, in fact, you have to be more righteous than the Pharisees who are good at all the external stuff because righteousness begins in the heart. And the Jews are saying, yeah, but how do you quantify that? How can you tell? How can you know that you're being righteous? They had depended on the law to bring about the kind of behaviors that were needed to be righteous, and everything had changed. And maybe they're feeling, this is weak, this is foolish, this is ineffective. It's not bringing about the character transformation that's required to be righteous. What does the good news say? Spoiler alert for a few weeks from now, Romans 3:21 says, now God has shown us a way to be made right or to be made righteous without keeping the requirements of the law. How is that possible? King David said in Psalm 19 that the law is perfect. Foolishness, powerless, offenses. I'm ashamed to call the good news because it's so weak and ineffective. Paul dealt with this with the Corinthians as well. 1 Corinthians 1, verse 23. When we preach that Christ was crucified, the Jews are offended, and the Gentiles say it's all nonsense. But to those called by God to salvation, both Jews and Gentiles, listen to this, Christ is the power and wisdom of God. This foolish plan of God is wiser than the wisest of human plans, and God's weakness is stronger than the greatest of human strength. There's something about the gospel that's more powerful than Rome or Caesar, wiser than any law, more capable to save than any army, more able to transform than any law. The good news, the gospel, is the answer to all of these challenges. How can we become righteous when we can't even live up to our own standards, let alone the standards of God? The good news can make us righteous. How can we have unity in the church when we have so many differences among us? The good news can bring unity in the church. So the question that remains then for 21st century Christians in Abbotsford is, are you ashamed of the gospel? For Paul, this good news isn't the entry-level Christian stuff that we move on from once we learn it. The good news is actually what we need on a continual basis. That's why he told the Romans, I want to come to you to preach the gospel. But Paul, they're already Christians. Why do they need the gospel? Because the gospel is what we always need. The gospel is step 1, step 2, step 3, all the way to infinity. We constantly need a reminder and a retelling of the gospel in our lives, whether you've been a Christian for 5 minutes or 50 years. What you need more of is the good news of Jesus. Because Paul says it is the power of God at work saving everyone who believes. It's the power of God. You want more of God's power in your life? You need more of the gospel. You want to be saved from sin or from a bad habit, from a bad situation, from pain or anguish or fear? You need the gospel. Do we want a church that's unified even when we have lots of differences? We need the gospel. You see, we can fall into the same 2 traps that the Romans did. We can prove that we are ashamed of the gospel when we think that a crucified Lord isn't strong enough to save or transform our world. When we rely more on human power to get the job done instead, when we pledge loyalty to modern-day Caesars to conquer our enemies with worldly powers and worldly tools instead of relying on Jesus to conquer enemies with the cross of love. We can prove to be ashamed of the gospel when we don't think God's grace is powerful enough to transform hearts, when we think the answer is more rules, more regulations, even laws and legislation to bring about the character transformation and restrain sin and evil in the world. We might be able to restrain sinful hearts and sinful actions, but we will never transform hearts through rules and regulations. And this is what God most cares about. Only the good news can do that. We're not ashamed of the gospel. We're not ashamed of the good news. It is the power of God that brings salvation to those who believe.
Thank you for listening to the APA podcast. We hope it helps you better follow Jesus in your home, city, and around the world.